The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you and enjoy. There's an old story of a rabbi giving a talk in a synagogue, and he's really going at it, and he's talking about how, in this sermon, of how who you think you are is not who you really are. You know, how you are this human form, but that human form is animated by this life force that is timeless and effortless, and you are not who you think you are. You are nothing. And he said it with such fervor that one of the leading people in the community, you know, the doctor in the whole town, he was so struck by it. You know, he ran up to the altar, and he's just groveling at the altar saying, I'm nothing, I get it. And then the president of the university, he suddenly gets it, and he runs up to the altar, and he's groveling and saying again and again, I'm nothing. And the janitor of the synagogue, he gets it, and he goes up, and he's rolling at the altar, I'm nothing. And the bank president says to the doctor, so look who thinks he's nothing. Every spiritual practice, every religious tradition ultimately points toward a really profound question, which is, who are you? Or what are you? As you become more self-aware, you naturally start wondering, well, what is this mystery all about? Contemplating that question of who and what you are can be kind of terrifying, but it can also be quite liberating. Here's a quote, which we're going to explore a little bit. To study the way of the Buddha is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drops away. What does that mean? This exploration, this really profound teaching on not self or anatta can be really confusing and out there when we try to figure it out intellectually. And yet, as I've kind of heard these teachings over the years, there's also something very intuitively resonant about it, because I am pretty sure you have had experiences in your life of not self, when your conditioned presence has kind of fallen away, and the moment is there, and it's big, and it's alive, and it's a mystery. Anytime you've experienced the mystery, or if you experienced the flow state, that sense of I and mine, that tightly held sense of, well, this is who I am, this is my story, when that gets porous or falls away, things get really, really interesting. So having a strong sense of self is helpful in life. But at the same time, you know, as I've shared before, that line that we used to use when I lived in the ashram of no car problems, no relationship problems. And my good friend Anam Tugden, who will be doing the New Year's retreat with us this year, he's got a great book that says, no self, no problem. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is, number one, what is the self? What are we talking about when we talk about a self? And what does it mean to know the self? And then what does it mean to forget the self? And then if you explore this not self, or what I think of as a selfless self, what does it mean to be a selfless self in a world of selfish selves? So, a good friend that asked me a while back, well, what is Zen? What is Zen? And so I wrote back in my own experience, I have these thoughts. If I had a little more money in my IRA, Zen, I would be happy. If Tom Brady wins another Super Bowl, Zen, I'm going to be really happy. And if my hair would start growing back, Zen, I'd be unbelievably happy. Have you ever noticed how your life is an ever-rolling self-improvement process? That there's always something for you to do to get a little more better at something? What's behind that? And what informs this whole mechanism of the self is desire. We're always looking for the next thing. And so much of life and so much of spiritual practice is the practice of self-improvement. It's becoming a better partner, a better listener, becoming more flexible, purifying your diet. It's all about this process of self-improvement. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's quite powerful to really look at how can you be more skillful in your life. You have certain goals and objectives. How can you live your life in a way that you can manifest those better? It's all good stuff. But it's also a bit of a treadmill, because it's a never-ending process of self-improvement. So while we have the path of means, this path of self-improvement, there's also the path of liberation, the path of cutting through. A milestone for me a number of months back, as I would from time to time check online, I was getting closer and closer to 1 million downloads of my podcast. And I was really looking forward to it, hitting that milestone. And then I hit it. And it was really nice for a day. I realized the fun was really in the anticipation. And so on Facebook, I put this post saying, hey, I just hit 1 million downloads. That's kind of cool. And then I got this comment from someone, I don't know who it was, who said, gee, I thought you were beyond paying attention to anything like that. And so I responded, no, I'm not. I had some good friends who they had their own business and they went bankrupt and they went back and they made more and they went to their financial advisor. And their financial advisor said, you're doing great. 7 more years and you're going to be okay. And they said, nope, we're done. They knew how much was enough. And I think that's a really interesting question. How much is enough in our lives? How much is enough money for you to say, I'm going to be okay? Is there a number? Or is it a concept that just keeps kicking around that really hasn't settled and keeps that sense of the clench inside? So our lives are driven by desire. And John D. Rockefeller, who was once the richest man in the world, was asked by a reporter, well, how much is enough? And he smiled and he said, just a little bit more. And that kind of summarizes our essential nature. There's a classic archetype in Buddhist literature of the hungry ghost. And these hungry ghosts are these beings who have these big bellies and tiny, tiny little throats and tiny little mouths. And they're sort of condemned to this experience of having this great appetite, but not able to get enough. And in many ways, that symbolizes our essential nature. We have this vast appetite, and it's unquenchable. No matter what we're doing, it's not quite enough. And of course, that's the seed of all addictive behavior. Looking for something that's going to fill us inside. So this wanting and desiring, it sets the whole thing in motion. The entire chain of events is built on desire. The antidote, or one of the antidotes, is to explore non-desire. You could say that enlightenment is the absence of desire. When you're not wanting anything, you have just dramatically put the whole mechanism in neutral. It's part of the amazing power of cultivating gratitude and cultivating appreciation. That when you say, thank you, this is perfect, this is enough right now, your entire physiology changes, your brain chemistry changes, all of it shifts in a really, really powerful way. That's why Werner Erhard, the founder of EST, famously said that the quickest way to be happy is to choose what you already have. It works. So, what about knowing the self? So I'm just back from a retreat, from a week-long retreat. I see some survivors here among us. And I led this retreat with Tara and Sebene Selassie, a teacher from New York, and Ruth King, who taught here a couple of weeks ago. And Ruth teaches a lot about race and diversity, and she just had this one question that I thought was so interesting. She said, when did you first recognize that you were a member of a race? And that recognition, curious how many people have a sense of that, when that moment was. Suddenly there's that recognition of like, oh, I'm separate, I'm different, I'm part of a tribe. And it reminded me of a training I did on diversity. I was part of a small group, and there was a woman, I'll call her Shauna, and she was sharing about, I think she grew up in Trinidad, and she had this cousin that she loved who was much older than her. He really had her on a pedestal. She was outgoing and worldly and, very active socially. And she was listening to her in another room. And her cousin was saying, where they were talking about dating. And she said, talking about how popular she was. And she said, I'm so glad I'm lighter skinned and not like Shauna. And that moment for her was just this searing moment of there's something wrong with me. And it's related to how I look and the color of my skin, and that a very, very deep sense of that searing sense of I'm different. That's just one element that where we we start to gather information as we come into this life that we're different. And it's fascinating when you really look at how much does your conditioning play in who you are right now. I used to do a lot of fundraising at one point, and I would do these workshops on abundance, and I would always ask this question, to fill in the blank. One thing my father always said about money was, and then to really look, is that your attitude about money? Are you the same political affiliation as your primary caretakers? Like, how much have you taken on through your conditioning, through growing up? So your primary caretakers, your family, where you went to school, your socioeconomic level, these are all create imprints on your psyche. It's fascinating now when they look at whether you were read to or not as a child, the effect that has on the development of your brain, how good your nutrition was, how much that shapes your fundamental health as you go through life. All of this conditioning has formed and created who you are. Your preferences, your dislikes, your beliefs, your habits, your character is a product of conditioning. When you start to pause in your life and you start to cultivate non-judging awareness or mindfulness, it can very efficiently start to reveal your conditioning. You're suddenly more and more aware of how you're reacting to things. You start to see how you avoid discomfort, how you seek pleasure. You begin to see into the nature of all of your separate individual personalized desires. And you begin to see how many of your desires ultimately aren't fulfilling. And it becomes this practice of really paying attention to your experience as you see the conditioning playing out in your life. It's the difference between being reactive to life and responding. So there was a moment during this last meditation retreat last week, in the morning instructions, and we kind of ring a bell, then there's 15 minutes for people to ask questions about the practice. And so when the bell rang, a young man raised his hand and he said, as I recollect it, he said, when you rang the bell, I found myself really disappointed. I was just getting into the meditation, and like when you rang the bell, I wasn't ready for you to ring it. And then he talked about how he traced that back. It was just one moment in meditation. The bell rings, and then wait a minute, I'm not ready. What an irritant. So part of tracing it back is investigating what occurs. And we talk a lot about this acronym of RAIN, R-A-I-N. And he recognized the disappointment. Wow, I'm disappointed. And there's also he noticed there was an emotional quality to it as well. The A in that acronym is to ask if you can allow or accept that experience. Sometimes you can't. But for him, it was like, well, I'm on retreat. What else am I going to do? So he then moved in the I, the investigation. And so, we're taught in this practice that when stimulation comes up, something unpleasant, you recognize it, you allow it, and then the investigation is in the body. And so he noticed that there was this feeling in his heart and in his throat, and there was this real sense of really, really deep sadness, a real deep sense of hurt and disappointment. And so he just made room for it. But the end part of that equation is to to nourish what you find with a sense of interest and compassion and empathy. And he suddenly, as he just sat investigating this feeling, like, what is this feeling? The other thing you can ask sometimes when you're investigating is, well, how old is this feeling? How far back does this? So he asked himself that, this feeling of like disappointment and sadness and hurt. And he suddenly flashed on, I think he was, later says like maybe, 10 years old, his parents telling him that they were getting divorced. And it was this sense of, I'm not ready. I don't want this. I don't want to be the man of the family. And so he saw that and he made room for it. He recognized it and felt subsequently much more free. There was something undigested from his past that hadn't fully been seen and felt. So just in that one moment, I had a desire to keep meditating. The bell rang that disappointed me. And because of his stillness and his concentration, he was able to trace that back. All part of that early conditioning. That sense of, I'm not ready. So what this points to is, what does it mean to really know the self? To really know who and what you are. So I'd like to share something that really points toward how awareness can set you free. And this is some words from the Buddha. The translations were always really clunky. But I thought it might be interesting to share some of the translation from original text. This is where the Buddha says to the monks, I will teach you the burden, the carrier of the burden, the taking up of the burden, and the casting off of the burden. And he goes on to say, and which is the burden? And he calls it the 5 clinging aggregates. Which 5? Form is a clinging aggregate. Feeling is a clinging aggregate. Perception is a clinging aggregate. Fabrications, consciousness. This is called the burden. And which is the carrier of the burden? The person, it should be said. The one with a name and a clan name. First name, last name. The craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. This is called taking up the burden. And what is casting off the burden? The remainderless dispassion sensation. Letting go of that craving. This is the casting off of the burden. He goes on to say, an uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person who is not well-versed or disciplined in the Dharma, who has no regard for people of integrity, is not disciplined, assumes the form to be the self, or the self as possessing form. He assumes feeling to be the self. He assumes perception to be the self. He assumes fabrications, mental fabrications, to be the self. He assumes consciousness to be the self. So part of what we fall into is believing that form and feeling and perception and story and consciousness is who we are. Of course, it's utterly natural. We live in this conditioned world. You have a body, you've got feelings, you perceive these feelings, you've got your stories. You even have like that which is aware of your stories. That's the nature of the self. But it's not ultimately who you are. Because you are the one who is aware of all of that. Does that make sense? So then the question becomes, where's the freedom in all of this? We have moments. I'm sure we've all had moments in our lives where we're simply awake to the mystery. I was, as I often yak about my paddling in the mornings. It's one of my favorite things, is paddling on the Potomac. And it's been a horrible year for paddling because it's been a perpetual flood this year. But I remember last year, right about this time, I was paddling pretty hard against the strong current and worked my way upriver a good way. And then I thought I would do a little practice, which I do sometimes, where I just sort of sit, sort of zazen, and just have my eyes open. And I just let the current take me. And I kind of try to let go of all control, unless I'm hitting some rapids. And it's one particular time, as I'm just floating down, it was a little bit like a Disney movie. But the bald eagles were flying in material for their nest. And I tried to be really, really still. So they're crossing in front of my path. And there were herons kind of all lined along the river as well. There's a rookery nearby. A fish would jump, off to my left. Geese would come up river overhead. And my boat would slowly pass a rock and then kind of get caught in the eddy, and then suddenly I'd be looking upstream for a while. And I had this moment, it was also kind of foggy. And I just had this thought of like, well, what if I was invisible? Because I was so struck by how it was all happening by itself. Like there was nothing that was happening that I was making happen in my experience. And that sense of what if I'm just invisible, but my awareness is here? And there's something about that expanse of just sensing how life just keeps flowing without me doing anything whatsoever. So a short little reflection, if you will. If you like, you can close your eyes. And you might take a moment to let your awareness open to this whole realm of form, the outline of your body. Sensing the form of this room in which you're sitting, the form of the bench. This material world that is fully present here in 3 dimensions. Notice this realm of feeling. How many qualities of feeling can you identify right now? All the sense doors. Anything pleasant or unpleasant, everything in between. Can you notice the quality of perception? What is it that is perceiving right now? And you might just acknowledge your brain, which is processing all this information coming in through 5 sense doors. Can you notice now the process of mental fabrications, the story, the narrative and commentary that spontaneously arises out of this field? And can you notice this quality of consciousness? That is to say, it's kind of like a spotlight, that consciousness moves to sound. Consciousness moves to feeling. Consciousness moves to form. Notice all this happening all by itself. Form, feeling, perception, mental fabrication, and consciousness. Now for the next minute or so, imagine your body invisible and your awareness in the room, and notice everything that happens by itself. No doing. In these final moments, just notice the quality of presence right now. And then if you like, you can deepen your breath. And if you like, you can open your eyes. One element of knowing the self is about knowing your story, really knowing your conditioning, recognizing the impact your primary caretakers had on you. You know, your strategy for survival as a kid and how that continues to play out. It can be also very, very helpful to sensitize yourself to this layered experience. The perception of form and feeling, perception, the narrative that arises, and the quality of how consciousness moves from place to place. The Buddha famously said, "Nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine." And that deeply informs the practice. That when you're hanging on to that sense of I and mine, it's the very hanging on that creates the rope burn. It creates the discomfort. When you can let go, there's a greater sense of freedom. So then the question is, how do we access this? And one of the practices I find very, very helpful, which I share a lot, mostly because it really works for me, is really to think of meditation in 3 fundamental stages. And I think of them as focus, and flow, and let go. Focus is arriving. It's about using concentration to really enter into the realm of form, to keep the mind really in present time. When you do that, very profound shifts occur. A deep, deep sense of calming, a deep sense of presence arrives through fundamental concentration practice. But concentration does not lead to liberation. It doesn't lead to freedom. It It leads to profound states and getting a lot done, but it doesn't necessarily lead to an open heart and open mind. So then the instruction is to widen your awareness. And when you widen your awareness, you establish more and more this sense of who you are as the witness or the observer, your capacity to notice without judgment. And then you become more aware of the stream and how you're relating to it. And that's a profound place to be in a place of non-reactive, non-preferential meditation. But it points beyond that. And it points toward this practice of deeply letting go of doing, letting go of who you are as the observer. It's a quality of choiceless awareness, where you are literally choosing what is already here. In those moments, sometimes, there can be this glimpse of a deep surrender to presence. And it doesn't necessarily have to take a 30-minute set. Perhaps just another little quick 1-minute meditation. If you like, take a moment to close your eyes and now breathe in slow to the count of 4 or 5. Exhale slowly to the count of 4 or 5. And then again, breathe in slow to the count of 4 or 5. Exhale slowly to the count of 4 or 5. And then again, feel the sense of arriving, intimately awake in the senses. Now relax the breath, stay connected to the breath, and can you notice both foreground and background? Can you be aware of the breath and yet expand your awareness to a sense of everything that is changing? Who you are as the witness. And now can you release all technique? Choiceless choice. Is it possible in these next few moments to be aware of awareness itself? And if you like, you can deepen the breath. And if you like, you can let your eyes open. When we cultivate this sense of more a sense of the conditioned self, you automatically become more aware of the self, but you also become more aware of those around you. I wanted to share a little story. This is something I heard from Ram Dass years ago. I believe he was in England in this ancient church. It was like a 300-year-old church that had these beautiful oak beams. And the oak beams were disintegrating. This church was, maybe it was older than 300 years, but the oak beams were disintegrating. And there was no way that they could replace them with because the wood was so valuable, these ancient gigantic beams. And then someone realized that there were oak trees that were planted on the church ground. They were like 300 years old. And they were planted by the church elders, knowing that 300 years from now, the church would have to replace those beams. And I love that story, to be that aware of generations after, that you would act toward their benefit. There's a story in the Native American culture of how every decision the community would make, one of the main criteria for that decision was, what would the effect be on the children 7 generations from now? Can you imagine that? If our culture was to be really deeply reflecting on that, if that was really informing our decision making. So it's quite helpful to remember, anytime you're feeling deep stress, anytime you're feeling a sense of dissatisfaction or some form of suffering, that this particular teaching is really informed by those 4 real cornerstones of the practice. Number 1, suffering happens in life. Stress and suffering is part of the human journey. So to really look closely, to really acknowledge where there's stress, where there's suffering. The second is to really look at this second principle, that stress and suffering has a cause. And it has to do with this conditioned self. It has to do with clinging, attachment, and the inability to let go. So what opens up in the practice is to really look, where am I holding on? Where is the rope burn? Where am I identified? Knowing that, seeing that, the courage to see that is quite powerful. That leads to the third principle in this practice, that it is possible to let go. When you see intimately into that conditioning, the conditioned self, when you can really see it and when you can really acknowledge how that lives on the inside, it's possible to let it go. And you move from rope burn to release. And you begin to experience that sense of the unconditioned self, the quality of kindness and compassion and joy that naturally arise. And all this points toward the fourth principle here, is that this is a journey of letting go, a journey of recognizing when the conditioned self is gripping you and the possibility of releasing once again. So a final little reading and reflection before we close. If you like, you can close your eyes. This is from John O'Donohue. So much of what delights and troubles you happens on a surface you take for ground. Your mind thinks your life alone. Your eyes consider air your nearest neighbor. Yet it seems that a little below your heart, there houses in you an unknown self who prefers the patterns of the dark and is not persuaded by the eyes of affection or caught by the flash of thought. It is a self that enjoys contemplative patience with all your unfolding expression, is never drawn to break into light, though you entangle yourself in unworthiness and misjudge what you do and who you are. It presides within like an evening freedom that will often see you enchanted by twilight without ever recognizing the falling night. It dwells in a strange yet rhythmic ease that is not ruffled by disappointment. It presides in a deeper current of time, free of the force of cause and sequence, that otherwise shapes your life. It has the dignity of the angelic that knows you to your roots, always awaiting your deeper befriending to take you beyond the threshold of want, where all your diverse strainings can come to wholesome ease. So if you like, you can deepen your breath and let your eyes open. Thank you so much for your kind attention. My conditioned self really hopes that you found this helpful. My unconditioned self, I guess, is totally fine either way. Want to remind you quickly that I'm leading a day-long retreat on Saturday. It's called a meditative journey, and we're doing something called dynamic meditation, which is a really powerful, somewhat cathartic practice of moving from the gross to the subtle.